Paul, should we start by talking about how fertility rates are globally in terms of some of the regional correlates? Because I think it is now well known that fertility rates are very low in Europe, in Northeast Asia. There's less attention paid to places like the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, South America. So just give us a sense of the global picture.
Well, I came up with this term, the infertile crescent, where I suggested that you could walk all the way from the Straits of Johor to the Straits of Gibraltar, so across the whole Eurasian landmass, and only walk across countries with below replacement fertility rate. When I wrote that, I think in my 2019 book, The Human Tide, it wasn't quite true because Myanmar was just about above replacement fertility. It certainly isn't anymore. And as I've been watching this carefully particularly in the last sort of 10 years, or 15 years since I started my PhD on the subject, more general subject of demography, what has been striking is the way that fertility has continued to fall. It's fallen in places like the UK and the US, some of the developed countries where it was long-term below replacement, but not that low. Countries in Scandinavia, it's fallen significantly, but it's the developing countries where it's so striking. So I often say that if you go back to 1970 and you did a scatter chart, you'd see a very close correlation between GDP per capita and fertility, or literacy rates, or urbanization. Those basic factors of what we might call modernization correlated very closely to fertility. So a rich, urban, educated country like Britain would at that point be heading to about 2, and a poor, largely rural country with poor education like India would be up at 6 or 7. And if you told me a country's GDP, I could have told you its fertility rate broadly. I mean, there were always outliers, but there's a very strong correlation. Now, what's happened since then is 2 things, really. Well, 3 things. First of all, everyone's got more urban, more educated, and richer. So that would mean, just even if that correlation held, the whole world has drifted towards a lower fertility. The second thing that's happened is that poorer countries have moved far faster on the demographic progress, which of course we don't consider progress, smaller families, than they have economically. So you have countries, I mean, the astonishing thing is, if I take 2 random countries, which couldn't be further apart, more different, Thailand and Jamaica, except they're both quite poor, they both have fertility rates well below the UK's, 1.4 and 1.3 respectively, roughly. So it's astonishing that still quite poorly educated, and still somewhat rural countries are moving along this demographic transition faster than we would have expected. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, which I think is really interesting, is that once you get past a certain point, we're not talking about mortality rate here, life expectancy, that's also interesting, but less interesting, more predictable. Once you get past a certain point, that correlation breaks down. And very wealthy countries, or countries that are at our sort of level of prosperity, have very different fertility rates. Almost all of them have a fertility rate that's too low. But why is it that Korea has a fertility rate of about 0.7, whereas we have a fertility rate, I mean, lamentably, it's gone down to about 1.6, but it's still, almost a whole child above Korean levels. And I often take the sort of outliers in the developed world, Korea and Israel. They're both extremely urban countries. They're both extremely educated countries. They're both pretty wealthy countries. And Israeli women have 3 children per woman. And Korean women, as I said, have 0.6, 0.7. So we've moved out of a world where the correlates were material, economic, developmental, and into a world where more and more, first of all, poor countries are moving to low fertility, and secondly, in the richer countries, the key determinants are, it seems, cultural. Now, those correlates of economics and development were very measurable. You could do nice charts. We all know that culture is the slippery concept. In some ways, it's like the God of the gaps. Those who criticize religion say, oh, God is there to explain whatever science can't. And as science expands, God contracts. Well, that's not what I believe. I suspect it's not what you believe. But it's almost like culture. You could criticize culture, in inverted commas, as that thing which other bits of social science can't explain. But anyway, we could have a philosophical discussion about that. That's not what we're here to do. But this cultural bucket is required now to explain why fertility varies from a very sufficient and adequate 3 in Israel to an absolutely appalling 0.6, 0.7 in Korea, with many points in between. But we shouldn't think there's a nice spectrum in between, because from Israel to the next lowest, which the last time I looked was Ireland. But I mean, there are European countries which are a bit below 2. They're all moving down. But so there isn't a spectrum. There's a spectrum from Korea at 0.6, 0.7 to countries still at 1.8. And then there's this big gap. And then there's Israel as an outlier at 3.
It's very interesting that since the 70s, there's been the acceleration in demographic decline has been faster than the acceleration in modernization of other kinds. Do you think that might be due to Western cultural influence? Thinking of somewhere like Thailand, say, which has become much more Western focused in the last 50 years through television and all this, the internet, all of this stuff. Do you think that might explain why Thailand's has become more rapidly westernized in terms of its fertility, even if its westernization in terms of other indicators of affluence and modernity have been slower? Do you think maybe fertility is more mimetic, is kind of what I'm asking, than other economic signs of development?
I think that's absolutely right. The only thing I would question is calling it westernization. I think that's probably an out-of-date term. If people in Thailand are watching, let's say they're watching Bollywood films, they probably aren't, on Chinese manufactured smartphones. Of course, a lot of this technology comes originally from the West, but the idea that westernization equals modernization is, I think, a little bit dated. So much more technology is now coming from inside Asia and being produced in Asia. But it's exactly as you say, it is, let's not split hairs about the word. It is the fact that people are hooked into a technology, and that hooks them into a culture, which may be a very different culture in different countries, but it has certain similarities, and those similarities militate against family size. There was a very interesting experiment in Brazil. It wasn't exactly an experiment, it was a piece of social science, which looked at the decline of fertility across Brazil. And what it seemed to say was that it wasn't so much televisions. At first, people thought it was when the television arrived. This was back in the 60s or probably the 70s. When television arrived, people had smaller families. And they're all the sort of silly nudge, nudge, wink, wink. People had better things to do in the evening. And of course, that's just nonsense, because you don't actually need to have very much sex to have a quite large family. And you could have a lot of sex and very, very small families. So the idea, even if sexual activity did go down with the television, that wouldn't, if a couple wants to have a kid, given reasonable health and reasonable age, in most cases it doesn't actually involve trying that hard. But what it did turn out to be was not actually the televisions themselves, but when soap operas were rolled out. Now, again, I'd question westernization, because it probably wasn't Dallas or whatever it was back in the 70s. It was domestic Brazilian soap operas, unless you say the whole concept of a soap is Western. But again, that's semantics. Soap operas are often local. Turkish soap operas are very popular in Turkey, and Brazilian in Brazil, and so on. So what it probably was that people were not, it wasn't that they were watching the news or cartoons. It was they were watching these soaps about glamorous people leading glamorous lifestyles. Now, if you're in a favela, you probably can't aspire to that, but you're still seeing models of life that are very different. Women in beautiful clothes and stilettos getting out of fancy cars and in and out of air-conditioned apartments. I don't know. I've never watched a Brazilian soap opera in my life. I don't think I've watched a British one for probably 30 years. I think that probably changes people's imagination. and their aspirations. And at the end of that, they may still say they want children. And we know from the work that Miriam Cates, among others, have done that people say they want 2 to 3 children. But the question is, how much do you want them? Now, that's very difficult to quantify. The best way to quantify it is to see what people are actually doing. And once they have those aspirations, why they may still say they want children, in fact, those children have slipped down the priority list. And there's a lifestyle aspiration, which we almost take for granted in the West now. But actually, if you are a subsistence farmer in an outlying area of Brazil, and then maybe you make it to a favela, maybe you make it to a slum in a city, and then you start, at some point, your worldview changes. And of course, contraception becomes available and it's rolled out, and people can control their fertility rates, which, I think is a good thing. I don't want people to have children because they have no choice and because they're living mired in a world of no choices and poverty. But when they get those choices, when do they start choosing to have smaller families? And I think it seems to be very much around when they start to imagine an elegant, glamorous lifestyle, and a large family just doesn't fit that pattern. So it's not that you shouldn't have 1 or 2 children, but those people in those soap operas don't have half a dozen. And if you actually want to start buying some of the consumer goods that are dangled tantalizingly before your eyes, you may decide that a smaller number of children, particularly in an urban setting, makes economic sense.
Yeah, it's quite popular among pronatalists in Britain and elsewhere to point out that the ideal number of children is above replacement. When you ask people, I struggle to be optimistic on that front, though. So people will say, well, the average woman wants to have 2.3 children or whatever. All we have to do is tweak things and provide cheaper housing and whatever other government intervention, and then people will naturally do that. And I say, yeah, okay, but revealed preference is that people are not actually having that many children. The analogy that was used by Catherine McCulloch when she came on my show a little while ago, she's written this really good book about American women who have both been to university and had 5 or more children, i.e. unicorns, right? And
Hannah's Children, I ordered it from Amazon. It's taking a while to arrive.
It's very, very interesting. It's something I think it's a book I think about a lot when it comes to this. It's all qualitative, but actually the qualitative research reveals a great deal. She draws this parallel between, if we bought everyone, if the government gave everyone trainers, bought everyone really nice pairs of trainers, would we see the number of people running marathons increase? And she's like, maybe a little bit. There might be 1 or 2 people who would run marathons if only they had the trainers. But that's basically not the reason why people aren't running marathons. It's because actually running a marathon is really difficult and it takes a long time and a lot of effort. And the government can't do that for you. The government will not be there for you at the 20th mile. The government won't be there for you at 3 o'clock in the morning when your baby's crying. I think people basically just actually are not that motivated. That's what we're discovering. And there are only so many tweaks. I'm sorry, I'm getting all pessimistic about this. And I know that that's not, we must try and be optimistic on this front. But I am generally skeptical of the idea of policy tweaks being the answer to any of this.
Well, there were 2 things I'd say on that. The first is, if people said in surveys they wanted 1.5 children, that would be a cause of pessimism. Let us at least be glad that that's the starting point, even if it's not high enough on their lists of priorities, even if revealed preference suggests something different. At least in principle, they want that. So we've got something to work with. The second thing I would say is that government policy can only go so far. I think it's absolutely correct that helping people with housing and childcare and maternity leave is really important, but it's not going to crack the problem. As I often say, if you look at places in Britain where housing is cheap, they don't have a high fertility rate. If you look at Germany, much of Germany has cheap housing. Southeast Asia, the Balkans, many of those countries have cheap housing and they don't have a high fertility rate. Childcare is the other sort of big cost. And again, where it's highly subsidised and very cheap, and it is ridiculously expensive in the UK, but where it's really cheap and very subsidised in a lot of European countries, it's still the case that fertility rates are very low. So someone was putting it to me the other day, it's the kind of Guardian view of the world. Unless things are absolutely perfect, of course, women won't have children, and you can always blame capitalism or whatever it is. And, that may be true, but fertility rates were pretty low under real existing socialism as well. So if the answer is we need perfection, we need some kind of paradise where nobody has any economic constraints, where there's no racism, exploitation, sexism, and all the other terrible things in the universe, and we all live in a kind of paradise, and then maybe children will be born. Well, we all know we're not going to get there, and we can have those socioeconomic debates about what's the right level of tax and spend, and what are the right social attitudes, but we're never going to get to that kind of Guardianista paradise. And we know that people have had children in much worse conditions than us, materially. In fact, I call it the paradox of fertility, that as countries get richer, they find it harder and harder to afford children. And that when you look geographically, it's the poor countries. So whether it's historical or geographical that you analyse it, the richer people get, or the richer countries, the lower the fertility rate. So there's something much deeper than purely material conditions. Governments do seem to be able to do certain tweaks. I wouldn't dismiss that. And I think it's worth government experimenting, trying things out. But the other thing is culture. As we've said now, people tend to say that politics is downstream from culture. And I kind of parroted that. And I think there is an extent to which it's true. But I've been working quite recently. I've written a paper with an economist called Philip Pilkington, and we did that for the ARC conference, and we've written another paper for Policy Exchange, which should be coming out soon. And he said, why do you think that politics is downstream from culture? Sometimes it's upstream. And I think he's right. In other words, and he's living in Hungary now, so he's probably close to the source. Politics can shift culture. And there are famous examples of the legalization of homosexuality, for example, and the
example.
ending of the death penalty were both cases where the politicians, good or ill, and I certainly, wouldn't want to live in a world where homosexuality was illegal. So I think that's good. But we live in a world where there are cases where the politicians have led the culture, and the culture has caught up, sometimes decades later. So I think we shouldn't just look at the political world and say politics equals policy equals economics incentives. There is actually a role for politics to nudge the culture along. So, what does that actually mean? Well, the first thing I would say it means is that here we are in the UK, 50 years into sub-replacement fertility rates, and no government minister, as far as I know, has ever addressed this issue. So, as I often say, it's very early in the debate because nobody's really talking about it, but it's very late. So here we are 50 years on, where we had two generations that are too small, and yet we haven't even got the discussion underway. So one of the things I always say when people want policy detail from me is we're not even going to get, there's no point in going into great details on British policy until we get to a world where the people who are talking about this stuff are not just a few backbenchers, brave backbenchers like Miriam Cates, but actually it goes mainstream. When I talk about it, when people like Miriam talk about it, probably when people like you talk about it, you get a look. People roll their eyes. There's some, I was mentioning to you earlier, I was on yesterday, Radio 4 with Amal Rajan, and he's fantastic, really interested in it. And good old Rajan's had his fourth kid, so delighted for him. But in the mainstream world, it's really unusual. And in the political world, it's really unusual. So I think the first thing we need to do is mainstream, horrible verb, forgive me, mainstream the discussion. And that's why I've written my book, because lots of people are starting to talk about it, albeit not people at the political centre. People are, like Stephen Shaw, have done great work talking on podcasts. He's done a video, and people are writing articles. But I don't think, Catherine's book, I'm looking forward to reading. But what I'm trying to write, and I don't think anyone else has done it, I haven't found it, is a comprehensive pronatalist book that simply says what's going on with fertility rates, why this is bad news, how we can answer objections to raising it, feminism, something you and I have discussed in the past. Can we have a pronatal feminism? Immigration, why that's not the ultimate fix. AI, technology, environmental concerns. So taking head on, I suppose, those four major areas where people push back, and then talking about what we might do and how we might crack this one. So that's the structure of my book. I'm sorry, I've come on to plugging my book, which wasn't, I've sort of wandered unintentionally onto that territory. But that's why I think in this debate, in this cultural shift that I think we need, there is space for a book, and that's why I've written one. And that's my little contribution towards nudging the culture. I mean, I've got no delusions that this alone is going to make all that much difference, but it might play into something bigger. It does rather remind me, though, of I was at the Battle of Ideas, which Claire Fox organises, and I was talking about this. This was in the autumn of 2022, and I said that in July I'd written this rather notorious article for the Sunday Times, which they chose to headline, "Is it time to tax the childless?" And I said, I can't promise that I've stirred up a fertility boom across the country, but within 2 menstrual cycles of my article, both my daughters were pregnant. So at least I'm having a little effect at home. I've since become a grandpa, and with a third on the way. So, I have an effect perhaps on the small family circle, and I'm trying to have an effect on the wider national and international debate. We have to shift the culture. No one person is going to do that, and if it was one person, it wouldn't be me. But that is essentially what I'm trying to do.
I've basically spoken for this podcast to pretty much everyone who's written and spoken publicly about this issue, which is not that many people, right? It does remain a fairly fringe issue, even though I think, I'm sure you agree, that actually it's at the heart of most of the major political questions of our time. I mean, just thinking about the British general election, which is tomorrow as we're speaking now, the big issues that are being contested are NHS and pensions, tax burden, immigration. All of these things are completely tied up with the demographics question, and yet it kind of goes unspoken, the fact that this is lurking in the background, that this is actually the cause of all of these sources of political conflict. It's like the Ur issue, but no one is really talking about it except a handful of people, including you.
Well, I should give you 2 little anecdotes there, if I may. One is that years and years and years ago, a friend of mine who's a professor in Japanese and Korean studies and language, invited me to something at Chatham House. And it was about the Japanese economy. And this was years after the Japanese economy had started to fall. And the whole day, it was really interesting. Very interesting talks. And everybody just kind of assumed, of course, demographics was at the core of it. But nobody really talked about the demography. It's like, of course, that's what the problem is. So I absolutely agree with you. All these issues, pensions, sluggish economic growth, productivity, immigrate, it's all down to demography. If we had had a fertility rate of 2.5 since the 70s, everything would be different. So that's sort of anecdote number one. That was one of the things that started me thinking, why aren't we talking about this more, and what should I be doing and getting involved? And then I wrote my PhD and my first 3 books and now this one. The other thing, which to me was a bit of a challenge actually, I wrote The Human Tide, and for various reasons I got to know the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs quite well. And we were talking about my book, and I said, I'll drop you off a copy. He lived quite nearby to me, and he was this voracious reader. And within a few days, we bumped into each other again. He said, I really enjoyed the book. It was fantastic. And then he said, but if ever you write anything explicitly pronatal, you won't know what's going to hit you. Now, I think he'd made some comment or said something along those lines early in his period as chief rabbi. and he got enormous pushback. And actually, when I reflected on what he'd said to me, I thought, well, that's actually a bit of a challenge. Perhaps I ought to be a bit of a Daniel in the lion's den and stick my head above the parapet, to mix metaphors shamelessly. So it was quite interesting when I did start writing about this, and my Sunday Times article was the start of being really explicitly pronatal. I got enormous pushback. And I'm really happy to get a response. I'm really happy to get a sensible debate. I don't think everyone needs to agree with me. I think I've got some good arguments. I think we've got some good arguments, but let the debate go and flow. But can we please avoid this ridiculous invective? I mean, I was practically accused of being a Nazi for saying that we ought to have more children. And I wrote an article in reply to that. I think it was headed something like a demographer's response to unjust criticism, sort of a bit of a reference to Shostakovich's answer of his writing his Fifth Symphony, a composer's response to just criticism when he nearly lost his head over an opera he'd written. But that perhaps is a reference too far. But I said in that, how we got to the point where I'm advocating nothing more than the first commandment in the Bible, a commandment to Adam repeated to Noah. And I'm not doing this particularly from a religious perspective, but here we are, deep in our Judeo-Christian tradition. The first command God gives to mankind is be fruitful and multiply. And I'm not saying, well, therefore everybody has to be fruitful and multiply. You've all got to be religious. And but how does that get associated with the far right? And the other thing I point out often, and this is another hobby horse of mine, people on the left just don't know their history. So the best riposte, the most eloquent riposte to Malthus in a later generation was Marx, who was absolutely excoriating, as was Proudhon. And the left was quite pronatal. The Soviet Union, most of its period, was rewarding women for having children. Crazy things in communist countries like Romania that banned contraception almost overnight. Mao was very pronatalist, and it was only after he died and the Gang of Four were dealt with that they got an antenatal policy. And now, of course, communist China has a pronatal policy. Castro, the trouble with the left is they're heroes of one day are not their heroes of the next. And I'm not surprised. I mean, these are all horrendous people. And I'm not saying we should be Stalinists, Maoists, or Castroists, God forbid. Or Marxists indeed, which I'm most certainly not. But what I am saying is there is a rich and interesting tradition of pronatalism on the left. In fact, that was the sort of default left-wing position. And how the left got captured by a woke ideology that thinks that if you say having another generation of a reasonable size is a good thing, you're some kind of ultra-rightist. I think they are down a really weird rabbit hole. And again, if I can help get them out, they may not be my political allies, but it would be very good if this issue were not seen as I wouldn't even call it a left or right. It's seen as a sort of hard right versus the rest. And that's part of the problem, and it's absolutely crazy. And I think it's time that people on the left grew up, educated themselves. Of course, there are some, and I would sort of mention Aram Bastani, for example, at Novara Media, not an outlet I'm naturally drawn to for a whole series of reasons, although you have to respect what they've achieved. But he sticks his head out, or has somewhat stuck his head above the parapet on this. But there are very, very few people on the left who understand this, and who understand that whatever economic system you want, whether it's socialist or capitalist or anything else, if you don't have a generation to replace the current one, unless you can abolish aging technologically or something like that, you're on the road to doom, and it doesn't have to be a right-left thing, and that's what I'm trying to argue.
I slightly disagree, although I realise this maybe doesn't help the cause. No, it is true in the sense that
Tell
I
me
think
why
that
you disagree. I'd really like to hear, because you're probably more in touch with a leftist generation, your generation. I mean, I'm going to be 60 later this year. So the leftists I knew in my youth and childhood and young adulthood would not have, not that it was much discussed, they would not instinctively have been antenatal. And I suppose the ones in your generation are.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Yes, I think the big difference between my generation and younger Zoomers as well and older generations is not so much, it's not actually that my generation are more left wing. I mean, as we speak, Reform is the favourite party among 16 to 24-year-old males, right? It's not clear that young people are necessarily left wing. I think the key difference is that my generation are much more identitarian. And that can be expressed in both left-wing and right-wing versions. You know, ethno-nationalism is identity politics. So is wokeness. They're different types of identity politics. So I think that, yes, for an older form of leftism, which is much more focused on economics and welfare provision, low birth rates are catastrophic. You cannot keep the welfare state on the road with our inverted pyramid. That's just not going to happen. And I think probably smart people like Aaron Bastani is in some senses a kind of old style leftist, even though he's not that old. And I think that he recognises correctly that the things that he values, like healthcare, free healthcare and pensions and all this good, comfy welfare stuff, are imperiled by this crisis. I think, though, that in a sense, I don't know if you've ever come across this expression, the woke are more correct than the mainstream. It's an expression that's often used by the right, but to describe the fact that sometimes wokeness zeroes in on truths that actually the mainstream has neglected, and those truths, and often gives the wrong prescription for those truths, but in a sense has the diagnosis right, that wokeness identifies true things about human nature. And I think, therefore, that when people say that being pronatal is inimical to wokeness, they're right in the sense that I think something that is really deep rooted in wokeness is ethnomasochism, is the belief that basically like European descended people are bad. It's fundamentally like a really strong tenet. It's not always spoken quite so explicitly. It can be spoken very explicitly sometimes, but I think that that's lurking within the whole like ideological framework. And if you think that European descended people are bad, why would you want to make more of them? and they do consider it to be fundamentally suspect, the idea that you would value your own, even your own children. I mean, I've heard people say quite straight-faced, why would I want to have my own children when I could adopt? Why should I prize my children anymore over the children of people on the other side of the world? This like really, really exaggerated form of universalism. Not just that we should be sort of kind and respectful to other people or whatever, but that we should have absolutely no familial preference. We definitely should have no ethnic preference or national preference whatsoever. And I think they see the whole idea of boosting British birth rates, let's say, as highly, highly suspect. So in a sense, they are right when they say pronatalism is right-wing, but only because of the new way, I think, in which left and right are defined, which comes much, much more down to issues of identity and much less so towards issues of economics, which defined left and right in a previous era.
It's interesting that when I wrote that Sunday Times article, they chose to entitle it, "Is it time to tax the childless?" which is not the title I chose, but which made it incendiary. And I think the title you choose is quite interesting. I recently did a podcast with someone called Andrew Gold. Have you come across him? but he entitled the podcast something like "Wokeness is a Death Cult." Well, I didn't say that either, but maybe that's true. I've been thinking a lot about what I'm trying to do with my life at this stage. I was a business consultant. I've given that up. I'm doing this full time now. Last year I said, in 2024, I'm going to be 60 and a grandpa. I'm going to stop doing other stuff and just do this. So, and I was thinking, what can I contribute? And I think there are two things that I would like to do. One, as I said, is contribute to the demographic debate. And that's why I've written 4 books. And I'm increasingly taking a very clear stance on this issue and totally understand that a 60-year-old or 59-year-old white man is not going to move the dial in today's world all that much. And, when some diverse woman comes along and wants to pick up the torch, that's fantastic. I should go off and do other things. So I think there are two things that I can contribute. That one is this demographic problem, without which everything else will not thrive unless we fix it. And the other one is I'm very interested in culture. And my friend Ed West, I don't know if you know him, decided that he ought to set up this club in London where people can come and talk about the great landmarks of culture. He's done 3 of these, and he calls it the Canon Club. And I think there is a role for a podcast which does exactly that, which celebrates the great, instead of getting involved endlessly in the culture wars, there are plenty of people to do that, celebrates the glories of our culture. Now, I'm not going to get into some long-winded, really boring and controversial view about what our culture means and where you draw the lines around it and how you define it. But we've started to make some. I think we will release them in the autumn and see where we go from there, on just some of the wonderful things that our civilization has created. Now, a lot of those things are scientific, and I don't, unlike, say, Melvin Bragg, I'm just not qualified to talk to great scientists about their science. But we found guests to talk about some amazing things. Anton Bruckner, one of my favorite composers, Anna Karenina, my favorite novel, Vincent van Gogh, Thomas Mann. We're going to do something about Romanesque architecture, and something about Hamlet, just to give you an idea. If we don't love this stuff, and if we aren't excited by it, as I have been all my life, particularly by music, but also by art and literature, if we don't understand what it is that our ancestors have produced and how absolutely amazing it is, which isn't to take away from other people's ancestors, wonderful to have podcasts about Tamil dance or Japanese philosophy. It's fantastic. Can't we just celebrate the whole of the human race and all cultures, and in our culture, celebrate our culture? That seems very uncontroversial. So I think if we're going to turn this round, there's a demographic component and there is a cultural component, which is to look back at what we've achieved, warts and all, and say, oh my goodness, it's not just a political kind of settlement where people have a voice and dignity. It's not just scientific and technological development in which people can lead long lives, healthy lives, and infant mortality goes from, like, in the first year, a quarter of children dying in the first year to, at its best, 2 per 1,000. But also what we've created musically, artistically, and from a literary point of view. And again, that should just be perfectly uncontroversial. I suspect it will churn some stomachs and make some people very angry. But I do think that if you want to keep a civilization going, actually understanding, appreciating, and loving its output. And again, if you go, I know this is the old left, but the Soviet Union was a terrible place for all sorts of reasons. But they decided at some point, and whenever, early in the Soviet days, that the great monuments of what they call bourgeois culture, okay, it was bourgeois culture, but it had been created off the labor and out of the people, and the people should be given it back, and people were encouraged to go to the opera, to concerts, to read books. Dickens was very popular, obviously Pushkin. Now, of course, there were some people they didn't like because they were the wrong political sort, and I'm not suggesting we go to anything like that. But I am saying there was a time when the left would value and praise and wish to propagate the very highest in culture and civilization. And I don't know where that went wrong. But I often think back to my childhood, and forgive me for being a little bit anecdotal here, but my parents had a shop selling luggage on Tottenham Court Road. And they had a woman who worked for them called Celia. And Celia and her husband were poor, working class people. They had left school probably at 14, they'd gone into the forces and then straight into work. They had very little education. They were really hardworking, lovely people. And they aspired to great culture. Celia used to buy me books of poetry and records. She knew I loved music. So I think Sibelius is a violin concerto. She bought me a record for my birthday and said, you must listen to that. Borodin's Second Symphony, not even particularly hugely mainstream things I always associate with her. And then when I was working, I was meeting people in the workplace who'd been to Oxbridge, who had no interest in any of this. And I thought, what's happened to our civilization? That working class people with very few means and resources and not a great education would get their pennies together to go and hear Myra Hess at the National Gallery playing Bach or whatever. And now these very indulged generation, my generation, people who were very, very bright and had great economic resources and opportunities just didn't know anything about it. So maybe this is a hiding to nothing, but I do think along with demography, what I'd like to contribute is some kind of, and I know it's going to be someone much cooler and younger than me, but I can try and do my bit. So that's another point I'd make on that. And if you don't love your culture and your past, your tradition, even if you must see it realistically, but if all you can do is trash it, that's not providing for a future worth having. The other thing I would say is I was at a literary festival quite recently and I was talking. And the last question asked was, why are you so nationalist? Why do you have to have a national solution to everything? Surely if people are being born somewhere in the world, that's good enough. And we can bring them in. And surely if you take a globalist rather than a national point of view, there is no problem. And I rather turned it round on the questioner and I said, we're nice white European cosmopolitans, full of sin and loathing and all that. And that's fine. Of course, I don't think it's fine. Who are we to go to the Tunisians, a former exploited people, a former colonial people, and say, don't worry about the large number of sub-Saharan Africans arriving in Tunisia. The president of Tunisia, by the way, has talked about this. Your culture is just as good or as bad as any other. You've got nothing to value and you mustn't stop it or worry about it because people are people. What right have we got to go to the Koreans and say, never mind if you're not having many children, you can bring people in from Burundi. Of course, they'll be culturally different, but there's nothing valuable in Korean culture worth preserving. Or maybe they'll assimilate, or maybe they won't, but it'll be a different Korea. But don't worry, because your traditions like ours are rubbish and they're not worth preserving. So I said, who are we as white European cosmopolitans, having gone around the world as imperialists, now to go around the world to these more and more countries that are having low fertility rates and say there's nothing in your cultures worth preserving. It really doesn't matter. I suppose what my point there is that there was a time when low fertility rates were predominantly a white European issue. And if you weren't happy with them, you could be accused of being a racist. Ridiculous suggestion, but there you go. As this goes global, I mean, Jamaica, I've mentioned already, fertility rate 1.4. It's not going to have any immigration. So even without emigration, it's just going to wane and decline. Some people think that reggae music, for example, is wonderful. Now, it's not my thing, but I've got no problem with it. Jamaica is a civilization. It's a culture. It's part of a wider Caribbean culture that has emerged from its own historical circumstances, very difficult, slavery, settlement, and all that is their history and their culture. And out of that has come a culture. Who are we to say that's not worth preserving, it's not worth having children? So my point is really this is now a global phenomenon. And any culture, any civilization, any nation, any people that has got some sense of itself and wishes to preserve and continue as a culture, evolving, self-critical for sure, should be worried about it. It's no longer the preserve of white European people. So if you're addressing the problem of low fertility and you're a self-loathing European, fine. What's your answer for low fertility in Jamaica, Thailand, Tunisia? So I suppose that would be my, again, rather lengthy answer to your question.
Well, of course, some people would go a step further and not just be ethno-masochists, but also be misanthropic and would say, go the full gamut on the environmental view that we're a plague on the earth and we're causing irreparable damage, etc. That is becoming more and more, and of course you address this in the book, more and more influential in the response to pronatalism. And actually, you notice, I mean, I often read the comments under any given article about pronatal issues, in the two things that crop up most often, and in places like the Times, centrist papers, as well as right-wing papers like the Mail and the Telegraph, the two most common objections that you get are not, of course, the ethno-masochistic ones necessarily, but one, I don't want to subsidise the underclass to have children. That's the key thing that you'll see on the Daily Mail. They're having too many already. And two, humans about the environment. There are too many of us. Everything's too busy already. Why would I want to have even more humans on the planet? That is an extraordinarily mainstream view. And yes, it is really, really contrary to be fruitful and multiply. It's very, very contrary to the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. And indeed, I think probably the religious tradition of every time and place, right? Like any religion that doesn't encourage people to have children is a religion that's going to die, that's going to kill itself. It's like that. Pronatalism is an essential component of any successful ideology long term. And yet people have jettisoned it quite quickly and confidently. What's your response to that environmental objection? Not even, I mean, the misanthropic objection is a bit more difficult philosophically, but what's your objection to the more empirical environmental objection?
So first of all, in terms of the lower, we're not going to subsidise the lower orders breeding. It's obviously pretty disgusting. I would say, well, who do you think will be driving a tanker to your petrol station so you can drive your car? Who do you think will be a doctor in the future? Because a lot of doctors and nurses come from quite modest backgrounds. Who do you think will be looking after you in the old care home? Do you think all your nice middle class friends' children will be doing those things, and will there be enough of them? So even if you take a purely selfish point of view, who do you think is going to provide the labour force? Or do you think AI is going to take you to the doctor, do your brain surgery, pick up your bins, and so on? So that would be one response. More generally, I always say I talk about quantities, not quality. I won't make eugenicist statements. I don't judge one race or culture against another. And since a post-war period, the only countries I know of which have pursued ethnic specific pronatalism are communist ones. Russia had, in the 80s, rolled out some pronatal policies, supposedly for the whole country, started in the Russian heartland, never went to the Caucasus or Central Asia. Romania made it easier to get contraception if you were an ethnic Hungarian, was happy for Germans and Jews to leave the country. And China is also now having a sort of ethnic pronatalism. So it seems to me only communists who suggest pronatalism. So I'm totally neutral. A person is a person as far as I'm concerned from a demographic point of view. As you were talking about antinatalism, I thought actually of the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. So Peter Singer's idea is we start off caring for ourselves, and then we care for our family, then we care for our community, then we eventually have moral sentiments and care for the whole of humanity, and then ultimately for all sentient creation. That's a nice idea, Peter Singer's. And then I thought there's a sort of obverse to that, and this just occurred to me as you were speaking. First of all, we hate our own. First of all, we say we don't want to have kids. Then we hate our own culture and civilization, and our self-hatred goes to a sort of at an ethnic, cultural, or national level. And then the next step to that is sort of an all-human antinatalism, which says nobody should be breeding. And I wonder if the next step to that is perhaps we can put all the animals out of their misery too.
Yeah, it's
So,
logical.
it's a very pessimistic view of the world. There was a time, I go through phases in terms of the podcasts I watch and the stuff I listen to. But about 6 months ago, I was listening to a lot of antinatalist stuff, which I do find interesting. So, what's it based in? Well, one perspective is there is something of it in Buddhism, and it's very interesting that Buddha is a really interesting religion, which I have a lot of respect. But empirically, Buddhists don't have more children. Buddhist countries have tended towards low fertility quite early on in their development. And whereas with other religions, the more religious you are, the more kids you tend to have. With the Abrahamic ones, that's not the case with Buddhism. And of course, Buddhism is very multifaceted. It's very complicated. You get different schools. But there is an essential idea of nirvana as nothingness, and that's sort of an ultimate goal. So that probably doesn't lend you to a very pronatalist perspective. In Western terms, I think Schopenhauer's probably your man or your philosopher. And of course, Schopenhauer, whilst wrestling with the Kantian problem of the Ding an sich and the Ding für sich, probably should stop there more or less, but essentially trying to figure out this Kantian problem, reckons that he came to an answer which put him in touch with ancient Hindu and Buddhist wisdom, which I think he did. So he kind of blends Kant and Plato with Buddhism and Hinduism, which makes him such an interesting thinker. But essentially, his view of the world is that it's all suffering, that we're either wanting something and we're in the lack of it, and then we are suffering, or when we get what we want, we have a momentary pleasure and then we get bored. Poor old Schopenhauer. I mean, by all accounts, he wasn't such a misery guts. But anyway, that's his philosophy for what it's worth. And if you pursue I don't think ultimately you can answer it very simply. If someone says it were better I had never been born, my experience is so much misery, and I assume other people are similarly miserable, and therefore it's better if none of us had been born. It's very hard to answer that if that is someone's lived experience, to use the trendy term. All you can counter with is, well, it's not my experience, that all life, by definition, wouldn't have evolved and persisted if it hadn't had some life force driving it, that most people don't want to die and don't want their loved ones to die, that most people don't hate their culture and civilization. It is still a sort of elite attitude, I think. In my book, I talked a lot about this, and a lot of it got culled, probably rightly, by my editor. There was a lot about Schopenhauer and antinatalism and different religious traditions, which I found really interesting. But the other thing that got culled, and again, I think he probably made the right choice, was there's the demographer. There was sort of somewhat poetic attitude to being a parent and a grandparent, which is, for me, my lived experience, if I'm allowed to have such a thing, is that this is the greatest adventure that my wife and I ever departed on when we had our children. They're now aged between 30 and my son is going to be 26 next month. We have 2 grandchildren with a third on the way. The idea that you mix 2 people and you come out with a totally new individual, like every snowflake is different, we're told. That's literal, not metaphorical snowflakes. I'm sure every metaphorical snowflake is different as well. But that every individual is different, that what comes out is totally unique and exciting. I mean, I do have a religious perspective on this, but you don't have to be religious to look at a child in absolute wonder and excitement, to see that child take his or her first steps, first breaths, first steps, first words. It's just fantastic. And so I'm the absolute opposite to an antinatalist. But if someone says to me, well, my life's been miserable and so is everyone else's that I know, and I don't like children, I mean, what can you say? Ultimately, I suppose it gets to the point of something that my old PhD supervisor, Eric Kaufman, a good friend of mine, has drawn my attention to the fact that there is some evidence for pro and antinatal genes. Now, I'm not a geneticist and I don't know, But it may be that there is an an antenatal outlook on life, an anti-genetic disposition with a genetic basis. And if that is the case, then that hasn't bred itself out of the gene pool, because for most generations, people couldn't control their fertility. They had sexual urges despite their antenatal views. And then for a number of generations, the pressures to have children were enormous. It was just what you did. Now we're in an age where alternative lifestyles open up, and it's quite feasible to say, I'm not going to have children. And if that's the case, we may be at the point where that genetic predisposition, I won't call it a gene, don't know enough about it, that genetic predisposition breeds itself out of the gene pool, and that what we're left with is just pronatal genes. It will take a long time to get there, and we'll go through an hourglass and have all these problems of too few people. But maybe the long-term reason to be optimistic is genetic. When only the pronatal people are left alive to have children, and so on. And the other thing is mimetic. So if the genes don't save us, it may be that the cultures which are pronatal do, which gets me onto another topic, which is which cultures are pronatal. We know that the Amish, the Haredi Jews, the Hutterites, there are pronatal groups with very large families. And I think that's wonderful. And I live in an area that's very Haredi, actually, or it's certainly Orthodox Jewish. And I see lots of children, 7-year-olds pushing their 2-year-old brothers and sisters around in buggies. And, I celebrate that. But what I'm sure is that if that's the only group that is going to have children, if only those very religiously committed groups have large families, we will have a completely different political dispensation. I don't know what it will be like, but a liberal world where most people are modern and normal and secular-ish, and those groups can thrive, is not going to persist. And the example I give in my book is a friend of mine who's a dentist, and he's mostly a dentist he's a children's dentist. The only one I know, actually, but he's made a very good living and got a very good practice treating just children. And at the age of 18 or 19, all my children went through him, he gently lets them move on. And he's got a big group of patients, and they're mostly Haredi Jews. That's the area we live in. And he's known and he's popular and he's trusted. Now, it's not to say that Haredi Jew won't become a dentist, but they're not encouraged to. All the scientific training you need to do, all the things you need to do, learn about biology, going to university, it's really difficult. So those communities don't necessarily create the professionals they need to support them. So whether it's genetic or mimetic, biological or cultural, there may be a way through this. But I think it's going to be a very interesting journey getting there.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.